as compared to the ancient and medieval imperialism. Modern imperialism was very different. Modern imperialism implied colonizing a distant territory and making the society and economy subservient to the metropole. So, whereas ancient and medieval imperialism was limited to extraction of tribute, modern imperialism implied fundamental transformation of the society and economy into in that particular region. Modern imperialism was based upon colonizing a pre-modern society, a pre-modern economy, and making it subservient to the needs of the metropole. After 1757, when the British East India Company, it acquired political power in India, it started colonizing India, gradually subordinating India's economy and society to the needs of metropole, that is England. Therefore, it becomes very important for us to understand how this process took shape, what was its impact, and how India transformed itself from the medieval feudal age towards modernity. Various questions whether the British rule in India led to modernization of India, led to economic development, or it led to underdevelopment of economy. As a scholar famously quoted, development of underdevelopment. Various questions: did British industrialize India or deindustrialize India? Did British urbanize India or de-urbanize India? Did British bring about agricultural growth, or commercialization of agriculture led to its stagnation? Did the British policy facilitate famines, or famines were natural to India? All these questions, they can be understood. All these aspects can be understood if we study the stages of colonization of India. It was scholars such as Ramesh Chandra Dutt, R.P. Dutt, Dadabhai Nauroji, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, who studied intensively the economic impact of British rule in India. And accordingly, the Marxist school of historiography, the Marxist approach, it identified 3 stages of colonization of India, or economic colonization of India. These 3 stages were identified as mercantilist or merchant capital stage, industrial capital stage, and financial capital stage. So let us understand how these stages were divided. So while studying the 3 stages of colonialism in India, you have to remember certain important years and events. 1757, when British East India Company transformed itself into a political power, up till 1813. So the time period from 1757 up till 1813 is understood as the stage of merchant capital colonization. So this first phase we have to understand, because 1757 the East India Company acquired de facto political power, and this political power enabled the East India Company to play a role in political formulation. Subsequently, we will see how the Diwani writes, it led to the British formulating policies with respect to revenue extraction and impacting the economy of India. The second stage, from 1813 up till 1860, is the stage known as the stage of industrial capital colonization. So Charter Act of 1813, it will withdraw the monopoly that was given to the East India Company as per the Charter Act of 1600, renewed successively. So after 1813, we will see the Indian economy was thrown open to English entrepreneurs, to English merchants. So this would lead to industrial capital, industrial revolution in England being an important factor in formulation of policies in India. And the third stage is from 1860 up till, let us say, independence, or maybe 1935, but we will take it 1947. Now this particular stage was that of financial capital. So we come across three important stages. First is the stage of merchant capital from 1757 till 1813. Second is industrial capital from 1813 till 1860. And then 1860 onwards, the stage of financial capital, when Indian economy was colonized via finance from England. So when we study the first phase, 1757 up till 1815, let us understand how in the first phase Indian economy was impacted. But before we study the first phase, let us study the nature of Indian economy. Prior to 1757, if I'm talking about 1600s and the early decade of 18th century, Indian economy was a vibrant economy characterized by self-sufficient village economy. So let us say that in India, if I'm talking about Bengal, in Bengal, there used to be various villages inhabiting the region, and in between there were certain forests as well. So in this village, there was generally the peasants, artisans. The production unit was basically this entire village and its peripheral region, where there were fields, agricultural tracts quite near to the forest area. So what used to happen was, in this village, there were weavers who were making textiles, peasants, they grew cotton. There were people who were indulging into various services such as barbers, cleaners, and there was some form of a exchange, redistribution, that reciprocity that used to happen in that village. The code of reciprocity was decided by guilds. Generally, the Mughals never interfered in the self-sufficient village economy. The villages, they had their own panchayat, and on the basis of that panchayat, all communities, on the basis of guilds, they used to carry out exchange with each other. Certain times, one village used to also have exchange with each other via the village merchant, who was basically a baniya. Sometimes the forest dwellers, they used to come at the peripheral of a village and used to also bring their forest produce to the village merchant. So you must have heard about something called Haat. So Haat was a market where the tribals, they used to come with their produce such as timber, laak, chironji, tendu, and all forms of forest produce that was usually exchanged for certain produce of the village, for example, rice, salt, and other forms of products. And then this was also brought into the village. And in this village, suppose there is brassware, coppersmith, ironsmith, all forms of people who were organized in the form of caste guilds. They used to have exchange with other villages. So there used to be a village merchant who used to play a very important role in the exchange. But this exchange was peripheral. It was not central to the village economy. Now this village merchant, he used to have, or whatever was the surplus, he used to also exchange it with kasbas. Now kasbas were big markets. So many of the times the village merchants, he had his own forms of connections or relations with creditors. So instruments such as hundis, instruments such as the carvan and all. So via these mechanisms, sometimes the village merchant used to sell the surplus to the kasbas also, and from the kasbas, these entire produce, they used to find their way to the port city where they were exported. So overall, if we look at the entire economic scenario, there were self-sufficient villages, there were guilds which were caste guilds, there was a village merchant, and mostly the village merchant used to sell the surplus outside in kasbas, and from the kasbas they used to be taken to the port cities and they used to export it. They used to export. So prior to the advent of British, the village merchant was basically selling the produce outside the village. So finished goods in the form of textiles, brassware, leatherware, copperware, they were all sold to the kasbas and from there to the global markets. And this used to be responsible for making the villages self-sufficient. The villages were having enough to eat, and these were not in any form of extreme these were not in any form of extreme exploitation. However, when the British, they acquired political power in 1757, the British, they started insisting upon tributes. So immediately after acquiring 1757, the British, they started demanding tributes, and the Britishers, they started misusing, the company's officials, they started misusing the dastaks. So what happened was, when the Britishers, they demanded tributes from the Nawab of Bengal, now this tribute was not spent in India, but this tribute was taken back to England. So this led to drain of wealth. Secondly, the company's officials, when they misused dastaks, at that point of time, the state, that is the Nawab of Bengal, was deprived of his revenue. So he did not have enough money to pay to his officials. It led to maladministration. And with maladministration, what happened? Now suppose trade is taking place to the kasbas, and if there is maladministration, there is theft during this entire transaction, it will restrict trade and commerce. It won't allow the traders to sell the surplus. And worst was, if you look at the policy of the company was driven by mercantilism. Mercantilism means, now the East India Company, it always aimed at mobilizing the surplus of India to the European markets, selling them in the European markets to other European nations, and import bullion in England. So in order to purchase Indian commodities, the English, they used to bring bullion with themselves, and via bullion they used to exchange Indian products. But after 1757, the British, they acquired Sultanati, Kalikata, Gobindpura, and later Mir Qasim, he handed over territories, 24 Parganas was handed over to them. So over a period of time, now the Britishers, they started raising capital from Indian sources and they stopped bringing in bullion in Bengal. Bullion was not brought in Bengal anymore. Bullion was not brought in India anymore. And with these resources, the British, they started purchasing commodities of India. And while commodities of India was being purchased, they were directly sold off to distant market or they were directly transported to England. So this led to drain of wealth. And further, if you look at 1765 Diwani rights, when the British acquired the Diwani rights via Treaty of Allahabad, now the British, they had only a sole motive to realize as much revenue as possible so that they could purchase as much of Indian goods as possible. In 1763, the British, they had already eliminated the French as competitors. So effectively, they deprived the Indian trader or merchant of any form of bargaining power. So there was monopoly of East India Company. And now with Diwani rights, the British, they acquired the right to impose as much of land revenue as possible. The British, they appointed Muhammad Reza Khan, Raja Shitab Roy, and they were told to raise as much revenue as possible. So when the British, they started imposing a high revenue demand from these regions, from every regions, the surplus started getting acquired by the British. And this surplus was transported to England. So what happened? The trade got disrupted. So there was no surplus taking place from these villages to the outside regions. Gradually, whatever produce was there in the fields, agricultural fields, a high revenue rate led to extraction of those tributes. Surplus was not left. The artisans, they were forced to sell their products at a cheaper price. They could never bargain. Indian traders were being marginalized. European traders, private trade, it benefited because of the political power they enjoyed. So what happened was, the Indian self-sufficient village and its economy got impacted when the British, they acquired the Diwani rights, and via these Diwani rights, the Britishers, they started imposing a high revenue demand. And what happened was, the artisans, weavers, they left their profession. Ironsmiths, coppersmiths, gradually over a period of time, they started realizing that there is a drain of resources that is happening. They were, rather than getting some form of a profit from economic activity, they were not even able to meet the input costs of what they were producing. So over a period of time, the capacity of this self-sufficient village economy to produce an output started declining. Famines occurred. And the net output of Bengal as a region actually declined because of the British. So what happened was, tributes, Diwani rights, high revenue demand, in order to raise capital to purchase Indian goods, it led to a drain of wealth. Various economists have tried to calculate the percentage of wealth, percentage of GDP of Bengal that was being drained to England. That has come out to be 2 to 2.5%, 3%. That's a large amount. It led to maladministration also. And rather than correcting these deficiencies, these maladministrations, as being stated via Regulating Act of 1773, in fact, the British further developed this particular drain via Settlements Act. So there was a 1793 Permanent Settlement Act, that happened in Bengal, and there would be the Rayatwari settlement that shall occur in Madras and the Deccan region. The first phase of colonization witnessed the British converting land into a commercial entity. So from a community owned property, land was transformed into a private property. Let us understand this transformation or concept of private property introduced by the British. Prior to the advent of British, a land belonged to the community. So the peasants, they had customary rights over the land. The tribals, they had customary rights over the land. The intermediary, whether it is Chaudhary, Khoot, Mukaddam, or any Zamindar, so they acquired a customary rank. There were certain customs via which there was a exchange that used to take place. And these customary ranks formed the basis of exchange in that particular region. However, when the British transformed that entire land into a private property, it became an estate. That is, the person who came to own that particular land, he could transfer it to his descendant or other person, sell it or mortgage it. So effectively, the peasant who was dependent on that land lost all customary rights. Land became a private entity, private property. The British claimed that the entire land belongs to the state, to the political entity, and therefore it was within their rights so as to transform land into a private property, and that was being done. And the land got transformed into a private property with the peasants and other communities which were dependent on the land losing all their customary rights. So they became dependent onto the will of the zamindars. So the Diwani rights, it led to high imposition of taxes, oppression of the peasantry by the Gumashtas, and Permanent Settlement Act, it led to depriving of those peasants from their customary rights. So this led to exploitation of peasantry in Bengal, and it also led to creation of a prosperous class of zamindars who owned large estates. While introducing Permanent Settlement Act, Lord Cornwallis, he hoped that transforming land into a private property, it would lead to agricultural capitalism. A new set of agricultural capitalists will come into prominence, and they will have stakes in developing the land and developing agriculture. But on the contrary, Permanent Settlement Act led to absentee landlordism, and its subinfeudation led to emergence of large set of intermediaries which further burdened the peasantry. So Permanent Settlement Act, rather than bringing about agricultural development, it led to further oppression on the peasantry, exploitation of the peasantry, and it led to underdevelopment of agriculture. The British policy of permanently making a settlement of 89% as the total land revenue did not work. So in order to correct this defect, the British in the Deccan and as well as the Madras presidency, it introduced Rayatwari settlement. Rather than making the zamindar the owner of the land, now in Madras and Deccan, Thomas Munro, he made the peasant the owner of the land. But it's very interesting to study how the Rayatwari settlement also had the same effect as that of permanent settlement. The reason why the British could not apply permanent settlement in Madras and Bombay Presidency was the absence of large zamindars like that in Bengal. Yes, you can say that polygars were there in Madras and Bombay region, but they were not as effective as that of zamindars of Bengal. So Thomas Munro, he made the peasant the owner of the land under the Raiyatwari settlement. And it was hoped that the Raiyat, with this private property, they would develop the property and they would develop agriculture. However, this plan also backfired because the British, they imposed a high land revenue and which was never fixed. So whether a land was near an irrigation source or it was far away from the irrigation source, it was subjected to a same high rate of revenue, land revenue. So many of the time, a Raiyat who had his land far away from the irrigation source could not bear the brunt of the land revenue and ended up mortgaging his land to the money lender and ultimately losing that land. Now, most of the time, the money lender was generally a prosperous Raiyat himself who had his land near the irrigation source. So, over a period of time, the Raiyats, they came to acquire a large territory of land and they also sub-infeudated their land. And ultimately, even the Raiyatwari settlement, it led to some form of emergence of large land owning class. There were money lenders also, which appropriated some land, but generally, if you look at the Raiyatwari settlement, even this settlement had failed to protect the interests of the peasantry, and the peasantry continued to be oppressed and exploited. So, from 1757 till 1813, the East India Company, which was mostly interested in trade and commerce, in acquiring as much of Indian produce as possible and selling it to markets abroad, came to bring about underdevelopment of Indian economy. In fact, the entire pattern of trade was shifted. For example, traditionally, prior to the advent of British, the Indian cotton was mostly used or was mostly transported to regions whereby carpet making, weaving industry flourished, such as Mirzapur, Agra. However, later, the British, when they wanted this Indian textile so as to be exported to distant territories. So when the British, they wanted Indian textiles to be exported to Burma and the other Southeast Asian nations for the exchange of products, it also started impacting the availability of raw cotton for the Indian handicraft industry. So all these aspects of integrating the Indian economy to the global economy via the British, whose interest was to gain maximum profits irrespective of its impact on the Indian economy, led to underdevelopment of Indian economy. So the overall produce of the economy actually declined during this first phase of colonialism in India. And this phase is termed as the phase of merchant capitalism. Ultimately, in 1813, we had the British Parliament depriving the East India Company of its monopoly rights. That is, prior to 1813, only the East India Company was allowed to purchase Indian goods and sell it to markets in England or outside markets. The other British traders, they were not allowed to go to India, carry out any form of trade, sell Indian products to England, to China. It was not allowed. It was a punishable offense. It was a crime. But in 1813, now the monopoly rights of East India Company was withdrawn. So the English capitalists, now we must remember that 1770s and 80s, there was industrial revolution in England. This had led to emergence of English capitalists. And the English capitalists, they looked at Indian commodities as source of raw material. Now what had changed is, previously the English capitalists, they had to purchase the raw material from East India Company because of merchant capitalism. And now these industrial capitalists, they aimed at directly getting the source of raw materials from India. And therefore, they started establishing plantation colonies. Now let us understand what exactly is plantation colonies. If we talk about agriculture, it's always divided between food grains and non-food grains, what we call as the cash crops. During Mughal times, what used to happen? The Todarmal system or the Mughals, they had always insisted upon payment of land revenue via cash. And this cash was only made available for certain commodities which were non-food grain items, such as sugarcane, such as indigo, jute, cotton, tobacco, opium. So generally, a peasant used to grow these cash crops only to pay the land revenue, but not for the market. After 1813, now the plantation colonial masters, the Europeans, the English, they started insisting upon growing cash crops, raw material crops such as indigo, cotton, such as opium for the China trade, tea, such as tobacco, jute, as a source of raw material for England. And moreover, the plantation colonies did not pay them the market rate for whatever the produce was realized. They were paid a price which was below the market rate. So advances were given, and this advance was below the market rate. So whenever the market rate was low, at that point of time, the agreement was arrived at and the advance was given. So that peasant was forced so as to grow that particular cash crop at that particular market rate. So at the expense of food grains, cash crops were being grown in the agricultural sectors in India. Now the agricultural sector was producing output to satisfy the needs of the English industrialists. This led to commercialization of agriculture. Commercialization of agriculture, it was not only disastrous for the peasantry, but for the Indian economy as a whole as well, because this entire phase was driven by the ideology of free market. That is, the Indian economy was more integrated to the global economy. For example, if there were American crisis, there would be cotton boom in India because India became the supplier of cotton. But the moment American crises were resolved, the cotton prices, they fell down sharply. And the peasant bore the brunt. So this commercialization of agriculture in India, it had a significant impact upon the peasantry because previous two rights, permanent settlement and Raiyatwari settlements, they had not given them any occupancy rights. So any form of global fluctuation used to make the entire peasant at the will of the landowner or the landlord. In the second stage, during commercialization of agriculture, we saw that now the British also wanted a market for the finished goods which were being manufactured in England. For example, the Lancashire Manufacturing Company, the industries, they all wanted their finished goods to be absorbed in markets. And we all know the Charter Act of 1833 and the famous Macaulay statement that he wanted Indians who were brown in color but English in tastes and choices. And therefore, the English, they started transforming India into a market for English goods. Gradually, the handicraft industry started undergoing a significant decline. In fact, one important aspect of this trade was previously these villages, they used to export the products out of the village, but now after Charter Act of 1833, products from England, they started making their roads inroad into the village. That is, now the village was forced to export raw material, or the settlement was forced to raw material, and via the merchant, now finished goods were brought inside these villages. So what happened was, over a period of time, India became a market to consume finished goods of England. And the major impact was upon Indian artisans, Indian workers, Indian traditional craftsmen. So previously what used to happen? There used to be a guild of craftsmen. Let us say there were weavers, there were ironsmiths, there were blacksmiths, there were goldsmiths. They used to have small guilds which were established. A merchant used to come. That was called a putting out system. He used to give the advance, the entire money. They used to manufacture it and sell it to the merchant. And merchant used to sell it to the higher merchant in the Kasbah, and from Kasbah it used to move to the other regions. But now all these craftsmen, all these artisans, all these worksmen, they started losing their jobs. They started gradually moving, shifting away from here. And these artisans, now they started resorting to peasantry. They were forced to take jobs such as cultivators, and this led to increased pressure on the land and destruction of traditional handicraft industry, which has been termed as deindustrialization. When commercialization of agriculture and deindustrialization occurred, so the traditional towns, their credit institutions, insurance institutions, merchant communities, traders, they started losing their source of income and source of economic activity. And these towns, their work was taken away by larger towns which were growing under the English patronage. For example, Bombay, Calcutta, Madras, these emerged as prosperous towns. So in the neighboring, there were certain smiths, coppersmiths, ironsmiths, brassware workers. They all started gradually shutting down their workshops, their work entity, and that urban center, it lost its proximity. So Midnapur, Murshidabad, it underwent a decline, and new towns, they started taking up their position. So all the traditional towns, they underwent deurbanization. So deurbanization, deindustrialization, commercialization, it became the major hallmark of, or it became a major characteristic feature of the British policies in India. Now, in order to facilitate the appropriation of Indian resources, exploitation of Indian resources, the British, they started introducing infrastructure such as roadways, postal, railways, telegraph, and they aimed at appropriating more and more natural resources from these ecological regions, natural regions. The forest wealth, timber, coal, produce was to be mobilized to England for their energy needs. So there was commercialization of forestry and ecology. And all this, it led to transformation of India from exporter of finished raw materials, from a developed economy into a subservient colonial economy which was functioning for the needs of the metropole, that is England. Now it did not stop here. After 1857, after the revolt of 1857, by 1850s, 60s, England had already emerged as a major capitalist economy, industrialized economy. And it had started incurring huge profits. Now these profits were to be invested in India. And these profits were invested in the form of finance. From 1860 onwards, the British, they imposed a bureaucracy, a steel frame of bureaucracy, army, and rule of law, so as to make a steel frame within which the finances which are being invested in India will be safeguarded. Their safety would be assured. So from 1860 onwards, there was infrastructure development, but this infrastructural development was at the cost of British capital, which were promised a high rate of return. But was this infrastructural development to develop Indian economy? No. The infrastructural development was done to realize a greater commercialization, greater deindustrialization, greater deurbanization. That is to ensure a further integration of Indian economy, subservient to the English economy and integrated to the global economy, so that India could serve the needs of metropole, that is English economy. So by 1860s, 70s, 80s, India started witnessing abject poverty. It was in the mid of such poverty that Lord Lytton, in the mid of a huge famine, that Lord Lytton held the imperial darbar. While the masses, they were dying due to shortage of food, there was an imperial darbar held. And it is over here that the Indian intelligentsia started pointing out that poverty, famines, they were not natural to India, but it was the outcome of the British policy. So in this way, understanding the stages of colonialism is very important, because these aspects of colonialism formed the basis on which the Indian intelligentsia was able to develop an economic critique of the British policies and lay down the basis for a national movement.